Hello, my History 115 students. This is Professor Donald Collins talking to you about week 5. And again, I'm going over the last of week 4 and thinking about the next couple of weeks. Thanks for joining me and watching and or listening to me once again. Um, Not much really to say about week 4. Most of you covered in some way, shape, or form the contributions of folks like Kepler and Copernicus and Brocchi and Galileo and certainly Isaac Newton to the scientific revolution that took place between about the middle of the 16th century through the end of the 17th, early 18th century, roughly the period between the highs of the Renaissance and the beginning of Enlightenment, um, and the decline of the church and the contributions of different cultures in some respects, and certainly the rise of science and the supremacy of science over, I guess, religion for those who were doing scientific work in this period. So, thank you for that. Just remember, too, that when people ask you about conditions behind something, they're not asking you for the contributions of individuals to said to a particular event. They're asking you for sort of the context behind someone doing something. Like if someone were to ask you, what were the conditions that set up how well your life has turned out to this point? You wouldn't just talk about all what you achieved. You would also talk about, well, my mom and dad helped. Circumstances in my life are about, prosperity and having good food to eat, not just, oh, I did this, this, and this, right? So you want to think about big picture, not small picture with questions like that. So anyway, in terms of week 5, we are entering the period dealing with the Industrial Revolution. That's what we're talking about. And really, unfortunately, the way the course is structured, you're really not getting a lot of context behind the Industrial Revolution, the steps that led there, the age of discovery or exploration or exploitation, as the case may be, of the Western Hemisphere, and the land there, and first, the riches there in terms of gold, silver, some gems, and other things first, and then later on cash crops that could be turned into product like tobacco, and eventually sugar, coffee, tea, um, and other things that would lead eventually to cotton, that would basically provide the money, the wealth necessary for the Industrial Revolution to take place in the first place. In other words, the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen in a vacuum and is not just sparked by scientific revolutions. It's sparked by really the exploitation of human labor and other resources and land of basically half the world, North and South America and the Caribbean. Without that, the Industrial Revolution, maybe it does happen, maybe it doesn't, but the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen in Western Europe without it, doesn't happen in Central Europe without it. Because, what we would consider anything close to the mass production of materials, if it was taking place anywhere prior to about 1600 CE, it was taking place in places like South Asia, where they were able to turn iron into steel and make it at a fairly massive level. When you can make 50,000 swords for an army at one time, that's pretty industrial. Maybe it's not assembly line industrial, but it is industrial. If it's China making molded iron wrought bars, right? That's another example of something that could be made in large quantity. They're able to do that, to make pig iron in fairly large amounts. Southeast Asia was building buildings with steel, reinforced concrete, steel bars, iron bars, really in this case. Again, doing it on a fairly massive level. Parts of Angkor Wat going back way further than the 16th century, going back to the 13th century, they were doing that. So, nothing's really new under the sun. When I've said in other courses like this that sometimes the Europeans begged, borrowed, and stole in order to end up with some of the things that we tend to say, or at least our textbooks tend to say, originated from Europe. Like the Bessemer open hearth process, that's not from, I mean, the way it's done by Bessemer is different, but the properties of it go back to South Asia and go back, really 1,000 or more years. So just as one example, the making of silk, the British stole ideas for doing that. Cleaning cottonseed out of cotton, the modern day cotton gin. There are iterations of rollers that would push seeds out of cotton bulbs going back at least 2,000 years and going back to South Asia and going back to the Arab world as well. Um, and some of those materials also made not only in terms of those previous iterations of these things went back to, have made it as far as West Africa as well as Europe. So would have meant that folks from those parts of the world had knowledge that Europeans had as well. Europeans built upon that, just like the Arabs built upon ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, just like they built on South Asian knowledge, just like the Byzantines built on Arab work, Arab Muslim scholarly work, and so on. Nothing's new under the sun. So I'm trying to give you some context behind what we're talking about this week. So industrialization really doesn't take place without the benefits of all that the Europeans are able to learn, steal in some cases, and build upon in the period roughly between the middle of the 15th century until you get to the 18th century. Now the Europeans really take off in the 18th century with those ideas to build things like the steam engine and the flying shuttle and the mechanized loom and other things that speed up processes for turning raw material into finished product. And cotton being the product that really jump starts the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century. So there's that. But to understand how industrialization isn't a good thing, you really have to look at how this whole thing is built. There's a reason why scholars tend to call this period not just the Industrial Revolution, but the rise of industrial capitalism. It's not just industrialization we're talking about. Industrialization by itself is neither good nor bad. To some extent, neither is industrial capitalism until you realize what you're trying to capitalize on. So when you think about industrial capitalism, you have to think about all the stages of things, not just what's happening on a factory floor, but where are people coming from to do the work? Who are the people doing the work? How do you get from finish, how do you get from, you know, how do you even get to the raw materials that are necessary for industrial capital to take advantage of, to turn into finished product, to sell to other people or to other entities and to make a profit off of? And the answer is you've got to look at this globally, not just what's happening in the UK, not just even what's happening on the East Coast of the United States when industrialization hits there in the late 18th and early 19th century, but you got to look at the whole thing. And the whole thing includes chattel slavery in the United States and the Western Hemisphere. It includes exploitation of labor in places as far-flung as Birmingham. And when I say Birmingham, I mean Birmingham in the UK, and Manchester in the UK, and France, and Italy, and South Asia, meaning India and Pakistan, and taking advantage of laborers and sailors and soldiers throughout that process in order to protect your supply lines. So in other words, the money from money that's made and the wealth that's generated as a result of chattel slavery, where you are forcing human beings to do work without pay, with very little in terms of benefit for them at all, really, in order to generate the profits necessary from that, to take, in this case, cotton bulbs, grow them, pick them, clean them, bale them, send them to factories either in the northeastern United States or ship them across the Atlantic Ocean to the UK, where it can be turned into cloth. And then turning that cloth into dresses, into pants, into shirts, into t-shirts, as we call them today, into khaki pants. And by the way, the term khaki is a South Asian or Hindi term, which basically is a form of pant. And those pants, originated from South Asia. So just as one example of how we use terms every day that we think originate from, say, from the UK, and they don't. Denim even is not a UK term. That's actually an Arabic term. So denim jeans, that originates from the Middle Eastern world, just as another example. And so the world of industrial capitalism is also a world in which not only are resources exploited, but language is exploited in its own way in order to describe the things that they're actually making and selling them. So there is that. And so these companies ultimately protected their resources either through mercenaries or through governments. And the British government was very good in allowing companies, more than any other government, at the end of the 17th and 18th century, to form companies like the British East India Company to go out and say, go forth and make profit, and pretty much by any means necessary. So if you can enslave a population to do it, that's fine. If you could virtually enslave them and pay them very little to do it, that's fine. If you could get your own mercenaries or pirates to basically steal your way to do it, that's fine. If you get your own mercenaries or your own private army to go in and basically force laborers to, mine for diamonds or grow cotton so that you could ship it back to your country to turn it into cloth, that's fine too. And that's how industrial capitalism got started. Without slavery, without forced labor, without exploitation of resources, it doesn't happen. And then once you start seeing these technologies um, come into being, once they get jump started, once factories get built, then domestic labor is exploited. And the urbanization, the growth of existing cities like London and Paris, and in the United States, in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and the growth of new cities, the building and growth of new cities like Chicago, for instance, to a lesser extent Berlin and other places, does not happen without these factories being centered in cities like this. Birmingham does not become an industrial town without the building of factories there. And so industrialization helps sort of generate urbanization, the expansion of cities, and the building of new cities. It generates migration and new migratory patterns as citizens in places like the UK flock from rural areas to urban areas to work. Or in some cases with the Irish going overseas to the United States in order to find work because they're being starved to death by the British government during the potato famine of the 1840s, for instance. Right? And so even in the littlest things like the railroad, between the environmental damage that it does um, and the fact that there are constantly accidents and there's all this competition means that even something as benign as being on a railroad, which enables people to move faster, to travel more efficiently, has a downside. And so then, this is what industrial capitalism is. It's the idea to exploit new ideas and resources and people in order to generate profit, right? And that can be a good thing in the expansion of some populations' opportunities, but it might not be such a good thing for so many others. And so hopefully when you do your post this week, that it's not just all about everything's great, all these people became prosperous, all these people lives got better. And yeah, for some, maybe 1 out of every 4 their lives got better, but maybe for at least 2 out of every 4 their lives didn't get better at all. Their lives might have gotten a little worse before they got better, maybe a lot worse before they got better. So please keep that in mind and don't just make this some sort of one-sided thing where everything's all good or everything's all bad. It's a mix that's probably more bad than good, but it's still a mix. So anyway, that's week 5. Nothing's due this week. That's great. And so I will, I'll end with that and, do another video next week.